And I want to talk about the appropriation of indigenous religions by people of European descent. Now, let me be very clear so that you know what my background is about this. I identify myself as a shaman. I use that word in quotes because a true shaman is a priest or priestess of the Siberian religion called Tengerism. I am not a Tengerist, nor have I been trained by a Tengerist, so technically I cannot call myself a shaman. So I'm using the term shaman in the anthropological sense, and I do that for very specific reasons because that's the term that most people understand and relate to the topic of animism and polytheism, specifically animistic polytheism, which is what I practice. So, having said that, let's talk about the appropriation of indigenous religions. Now, before I get into this, let me tell you my background. I started out as a child growing up in a Protestant Christian home. I went at age 18 after going through, the rebellious drinking and drugs that, most kids do. I then got my stuff together, and then I went into a Christian university called Biola University, and I studied to be an evangelist. And I was going to be one of those guys that preached on the street and or had my own church and all that. And after 4 years of being heavily indoctrinated into the Protestant Christian religion, I came to the realization that I could not follow this religion. I could not worship a God who arbitrarily threw people into everlasting torment simply because they were mistaken about God's identity. And I didn't leave because I didn't believe. I still believe. I left because my own personal ethics would not allow me to worship a God that did that. And I fully believed that I would go into hell. But of course, as a result of that, I got myself out of that cult environment. And I am absolutely stating that fundamentalist Christianity is absolutely a cult. After being out of that cult environment for a number of years, I realized that's exactly what it was. I then found myself following other, what I call paths that retain an unbroken history, that paths that retain an unbroken connection into their prehistory. And the first one was Taoist mysticism. Taoism is the indigenous animist, shamanic practice of the people of China. And so I got very involved in that. I got very involved in internal martial arts and in Qigong and meditation and energy work and Neigong and all that, and came to find out that all that stuff is not just some idea in your head, that there really is a science that you can tap into these forces of life force energy, and they have very, very real effects. And I share about that in some of my books. Awakening Sleipnir, I talk about my history in that. That was the first thing I got into. The next thing I got into after that, almost right on the heels of that, was African shamanic drumming, specifically of the Yoruba tribe. And I studied with a man who's still my very good friend and teacher, and his name is Baba Ayo Adayemi, who taught me his indigenous shamanic drumming tradition. And I also trained with another drum master in the Yoruba tradition, Francis Awe. And I had extremely powerful experiences in those traditions as well. Of course, during all this opened up a lot of other things, and I researched East Indian, Vedic, and Hindu mysticism, yoga, mantra, meditation, all that kind of stuff. And let's see, what else did I get into? So those were some of the main things I got into. During this time, I became very interested in my own ethnic, indigenous spiritual tradition. At that time, and this was back in the, when was this? In the late 80s, early 90s, I had the impression that I was of Celtic descent, so I tried to study Celtic stuff. I looked into Wicca and I didn't understand what that was about. I didn't get it. You know, having done some traditions, I didn't feel a connection. I'll just leave it at that. I didn't feel a connection to that. I looked into something called Celtic shamanism, which was very interesting to me. I looked into that. And when I started to research Celtic polytheism, you know, pre-Christian Celtic polytheism, I was confused. I just didn't get it. And I tried to get into the mythology and I just didn't relate. In fact, I remember one time I took a journey, I took a shamanic journey to meet the Celtic deities. And in that journey, when I got them, they were all looking at me like, what the hell are you doing here? You know, and they were all just kind of like this. I mean, it was like they were confused why I was there. And after that, I was like, wow. But, you know, it reflected I didn't connect with the myths and with, you know, and so I discarded that. It was very sad for me, but I discarded it and I said, well, either that's dead or what have you. And I stuck with the paths that I had. Taoist mysticism, African shamanic drumming, and yogic, East Indian yogic paths. But I went through a lot of confused feelings about that. Because on the one hand, I got what it was that I really wanted, which was I wanted practical paths of power that worked. By the way, I should say I did look into Native American shamanism, you know, because there's plenty of books out there on it, and it's incredibly attractive and all that, but to be honest, it's not that deep. You know, if I compare some of the stuff I read in Native American shamanism books, and I compared it to my actual experience in Taoism and some of these others, it's just very superficial. Sorry, I hope I don't offend anybody. That was my experience. I've come to find out since then that the majority of those books and teachings are appropriated and are not authentic Native American spiritual paths. And we'll get into why that pisses so many people off when I say that. So that's my background. So let me be clear. I am not culturally or racially in any way. I'm not a racist. I'm not a white supremacist. So how can that be true? And still I say that it's imperative that people at the very least learn what their ethnic, religious, and spiritual background is. Why is this so important? Because in all of these ethnic traditions, I always, except for perhaps the African tradition, I have to say in the African tradition, I did not run into any racism whatsoever. In fact, I'll share, this is one of the most amazing things, you know, that happened to me. I remember when I would play with my teacher and we would perform. And there would be people from Africa, you know, who were in the United States who would come because they wanted to be around something. They weren't even Yoruba lots of times, but they wanted to be close to African, you know, authentic African drumming. And when I would perform, because I performed what I was taught, which is very specific rhythms, very specific tradition. You know, for people who think that African drumming is just sitting around with a djembe and playing whatever the hell you want, you know nothing about African drumming. It's like playing classical music. You have to understand. And one of my teachers actually said that when you play the traditional rhythms, if you miss one note, you curse the whole village. That's how specific this drumming is. And it has a very real, they're like mathematical equations. When you play the rhythms right, that has a very real effect on the human body. So when I would play the traditional rhythms as I was taught, African people would come to me and treat me like a spiritual master because I understood and I was playing things. And later when I left and I moved to Idaho for a decade and I drummed out there. Ethnic Africans, they'd see me drumming. I remember we were playing once and it was sort of a drum circle and I was playing and these ethnic Africans were going like this to their friends and they're pointing to me like, this guy knows what he's doing. And they treated me with that same respect. It was amazing. It was an amazing experience. But getting into, you know, Taoism, Taoist mysticism, when you start rising the ranks in Taoist mysticism, you're going to run into some racism. you know, especially if you start getting good at it. You know, ethnic Chinese people are going to start seeing you as the white guy. You know, maybe not in all, maybe that's changing, but that's what I experienced, and that was made things difficult. Um, so you're going to run into that, and so this was difficult for me, and it brought up a lot of confusion in me because I didn't want to pretend. I mean, I knew the whole time that I was a white guy practicing these foreign disciplines, and I did it because I desperately wanted to connect with true, authentic, animist, energetic practices. I needed it more than I needed the air that I breathed. I needed it to survive. And these were the only places to get it. When I would play drums, you know, my teacher would want us to sometimes wear African regalia, and I felt uncomfortable doing that. Not because I have anything against it. I just, you know, I'm not going to pretend I'm African. I'm not. I absolutely appreciate the science and the tradition of it, but I'm not African, and I don't want to pretend. When I taught Qigong and Taoist martial arts, as I was taught, you know, and some of my early DVDs, which I still sell and I absolutely recommend, like Celestial Qigong, I dressed in authentic Chinese garb, but I always felt inauthentic. One of the things I ran into when I was studying Taoist mysticism, and I wanted to get to the really high levels of Taoist mysticism and magic. In order to do that, you have to learn Chinese language, you have to learn Chinese writings, and there are things called fus, which are talismans. And in order to understand those talismans, you have to really understand Chinese, and you know, it's a whole, and I found myself resisting that. I felt inauthentic. Not only that, you know, the lazy part of it was just a lot of work. It's a lot of work to complete, and I didn't want to do that. So these are some of the things I ran into, and I saw a lot of people, and there's still a lot of them out there, people who completely convert and become Chinese, you know, and they adopt Chinese culture and Chinese dress, and we see it all the time. People, you know, the Burning Man crowd, a lot of white people will adopt, you know, what do you call that? The matted hair. I forget what that's called. You know, and that just, it smacks of inauthenticity to me. And regardless of, you know, I don't have anything against how it looks or any of that stuff. You can dress however the heck you want. My issue is when you're doing something not out of choice, but out of a feeling of wanting to escape your own identity. That is very destructive. And I found that that's destructive on multiple levels. So let's get back to how I got into following my own ethnic shamanic tradition. I am of Norse and Anglo-Saxon ancestry. And I got into that because I ran into a YouTube video. This was at the tail end when everything started falling apart, and I was wanting to get higher up into the Taoist mysticism. And, you know, the universe has its plans, and I ended up getting into a conflict with my teachers who kicked me out of the sect. And that prevented me from rising up and training with the Grand Master of our sect. So I was forced to find things somewhere else. And so I started thinking to myself, well, maybe I'll look into Siberian shamanism, because that's kind of close, and you know. So I started researching that, and I'm flipping around YouTube and looking for Siberian shamanism, and I stumbled upon a video that was shot by a young Native American man, a college-aged man who claimed to be of Native American descent. And he was outside protesting a core shamanism retreat. If you don't know what core shamanism, Michael Harner, who is an anthropologist who studied animist shamanic traditions from all over the world, has created what he calls core shamanism, which is he has found that there are core shamanic beliefs among many indigenous peoples, and he's found that's practically helpful, and so he teaches that. And it's sort of outside of, but you know, it's not of any one tradition or one culture. Anyway, so this Native American guy was outside protesting one of these seminars, and he was saying that he didn't like white people stealing his religion. Now, core shamanism, Siberian shamanism is not Native American. So these people were not seeking to steal his religion, and I got furious with this kid. And for days I walked around the house, I was just tearing this kid apart. And I stopped and I said, "Why are you so angry?" And I realized that when I'm that angry, there's something wrong with me that I need to take a look at. So I stopped and I decided I was going to meditate on that. And so I meditated and I went deep inside and I asked myself why I was so angry. And I realized I completely agreed with that kid. 100%. Not so much that core shamanism is stealing his religion. That's ridiculous. But that why did I have to adopt another cultural, religious path in order to find true spirituality? Because one of the things he said in his video is that, why don't you get it from your own history? Of course, he has no idea. The reason why people of, modern Western European descent, why they adopt other cultural religions is because we no longer have access to our ethnic, cultural, religious heritage. It was wiped out during the Middle Ages, completely wiped out. If it weren't for Snorri Sturluson, who wrote down the Icelandic Norse myths, we wouldn't even know the majority of the pantheon of the pre-Christian Germanic tribal religions. We wouldn't even know what it was. So that's why, Native Americans, if you're wondering why white people are adopting your religion, it's because ours was taken from us. We don't know where else to go. So that is part of what got me researching. Now, something happened to me, which I want to share with you, which is that when I started looking into the Norse myths, because I had spent so many years in Taoist mythology and in Vedic mythology and in African shamanism, because of all of that, I had a completely different filter when I read those myths. And when I read those Norse myths, what I saw was the coded language in there that taught people Qigong, meditation, all of that. I mean, there are artifacts that show that during the time of the Vikings, that the traditional, the vulva, the women staff carriers, the women shamanesses, that there were people sat in full lotus and meditated in Europe. This is 1,000 years ago. And I went, wow, my ancestors did this same stuff. And here it is in the myths. Now, if you don't have a background in these traditional paths that have an unbroken connection into prehistory, and you read the Norse myths from a post-Christian Western perspective, you will never be able to decode the secret teachings that are in there. You won't be able to do it. So because I had that background, I was able to see this is in my background also. And so I was able to begin to recreate a shamanic, polytheistic, animistic way that I could use my knowledge of life force energy to tap into my own ethnic heritage. And what ended up happening is I started having personal experiences with the deities of my ethnic background. And I can't explain it other than something in my DNA was awoken. And I became aware that there is, there's an ethnic connection that goes back to these people. Now, all people, including Europeans, are of African descent. So that would explain why African drumming has such a powerful effect on me. I share this in some of my books. There's, some words in the Yoruba language that are identical to Indo-European languages to this day, which is a clear indication that at some point in history, the ancestors of the Yoruba people and the ancestors of the Indo-Europeans were once one tribe that split off and went in different directions. So, we could talk about all that, but, that's another way to reconnect. So when I connect with my African teachers and those traditions, I'm not adopting another culture. I am reconnecting. Maybe it went off in a little different side path, who knows, but I'm reconnecting to my African heritage. When I practice Taoist practices, I found that when you look at the language of some of the deities, one in particular, the deity called Di, which if you talk to Taoists, that's the ancient name for the sky father who lived in the North Star. His name was Di, or Ti. That's exactly the same name that my ethnic ancestors called the sky father. His name was, in Old Norse, Tyr. In Anglo-Saxon, it was Diu. The same God. Now, the Asian languages are not Indo-European. They split off much earlier than the Yoruba and the Indo-Europeans must have. So what does that mean? It means that the worship of the Sky Father is so ancient that even the Chinese and the Indo-Europeans have the same name for the Sky Father who lives in the North Star. I've got goosebumps. It's just, I'm tearing up. It's amazing to me. So there is a way for you, if you're a white person, there is a way for you to connect to an authentic, tribal, indigenous, shamanic practice without having to discard your own heritage. You don't have to do it. Now, this has come full circle because now I feel, and maybe I'm off on this one, I don't know, but I'm going to be honest with you. I feel that having now seen this come around, I'm seeing a connection that my ancestors may not have seen. If you were to go back 2,000 years, my ethnic European ancestors may not have seen the connection to the Chinese and to the Africans. They may not have had that understanding. But because of the way history has evolved, I'm able to look back and I can see these connections. So when I practice my indigenous religion, I'm connecting to all of the original indigenous practices, going all the way back to my ancestors in Africa 100,000 years ago. So it's important to do authentic practices in the traditional way, because in the traditional way, you worship the ancestors, and by worshiping the ancestors, you keep the spiritual connections in your DNA activated. So, that's what's going on. And I was angry when I wrote Shamanism for White People, and I specifically wanted to point out the destructive aspects of neo-shamanism and Native American shamanism and how destructive that is to everybody. And I specifically wanted to shine a spotlight on white people who were choosing to appropriate a tradition without getting the proper permission, not only from the people doing it, but from the ancestors. And it is my contention that neo-shamanism in many of its forms and in Native American shamanism, if done by white people who are trying to escape their ethnic background, it's destructive to everybody, and it demeans everybody's religion. And one of the problems that it creates is this. Shamanic pathways tend to be seen as something exotic and something that other primitive cultures do. And so people go on weekend retreats and they go to Native American shamanic retreats and they drum and they have experiences. And then they come back home to their white, suburban homes, and it just becomes, you know, I can understand why Native Americans would be so upset. So anyway, I've rambled on in a bunch of different directions, but I've shared a lot of my feelings about it. So I want to thank you, Rachel Dolezal. You've given me the perfect window to open up and talk about, you know, ways that we can connect to our own heritage as shamanic, earth-loving people. We can do it. We can do it without having to discard our own identity. And while I understand, I do understand why I completely understand why she did what she did. And I sympathize with her. And I understand why people adopt superficially or appropriate even superficially other religions. I understand it. You don't have to do it. And if there's anything I can do to help, I will. So you can read my books. You can search for Michael William Denny on Amazon.com. You can go to thunderwizard.com. You can go to thundershamanism.com. I have links to all of my products there. So thank you for listening to me rant.